So as you think about let's talk about the virtual reality element of it first, because I think there's a little bit of skepticism among those who have never used it before about how realistic it is. Give us a sense of how your technology and maybe virtual reality in general, how has it evolved to the point that it is feeling more like you're in the room with the avatar, let's say, or do you acknowledge that there might still be some element of that you can't replicate human to human, but there's critical parts of the interaction that the virtual reality does well and helps you and helps train you to interact in those conversations.
Yeah, so the biggest thing in terms of making virtual reality effective for education and training skills is around that emotional response to the content. So if you've never tried virtual reality, it's probably quite difficult to comprehend. But if you have, or you know someone who has, you'll know that when you put on the headset, even though logically you know you're not in that environment, there is something that makes you think that you are. So, I mean, the best example, and probably the most widespread example, is something called Ritchie's plank, where lots of people at conferences have done this, where you put a plank of wood along the floor, and you put somebody in a headset, and it simulates them like walking towards the edge of a building. Now, obviously, in real life, they are perfectly safe. They're on a conference room hall with just like a plank of wood that's like 3 inches thick. But you put people in VR and they won't walk off the plank, even though they know that they're perfectly safe logically, because their environment around them is simulating something else. It evokes that emotional response of fear and this isn't safe and I can't do that. So when it comes to skills like public speaking, you can immerse yourself in front of audiences of, say, 500 people. And logically, you know, you're in your office or you're at home and you're on your own, probably. But having that feeling of all eyes looking at you or having to speak out loud and stand up, all of those things are still feeling very real to you. So, in that respect, something like virtual reality can be used as a form of exposure therapy. So you could build yourself up to speaking in front of even just one-on-one conversations, or go to 5, 10, 200, 1,000 people, as you see fit and as you see comfortable. Um, but the crucial thing is it's in a controlled environment. So even if you feel scared, because it's in a controlled environment, it's not that, well, uncontrollable level of fear, because you know you can just turn the notch down effectively.
Now, is there a difference in the effectiveness of a tool like this for simulating arena size audiences versus conference room size audiences? Because they're very different environments. And instinctively, I would think that it's very good at replicating the big theater size where the faces may actually be hard to make out, but you have to get used to being in the huge environment. But in a conference room setting where it may be you and 8 people and you can see the faces and the reactions are more real time, you're exposed to both environments through this tool, but do you feel like it's actually it's easier for one of those settings versus the other to replicate it in VR?
So, kind of the opposite of maybe what you'd expect. It's actually easier to replicate an audience of, say, 500 compared to 5,000. And that's partly to do with the limitations in technology. So, um, things like if you had an audience of 5,000 people, that takes up, if you want like their individual faces, that takes up a ton of memory space in an app. So, it's much more rare to find those kinds of scenarios. Um, so yeah, that to answer your question. But you can do things like make the audiences more interactive to help with that immersion as well. So say if you had a big audience, you could have more 3D sound going around, and then it doesn't really matter the size of the environment, but visually, rather than everything else, including audio, just visually, it's actually easier from a dev perspective for it to be in a smaller environment, and it is ultimately more realistic as well, because it can be hard to get that real sense of depth and distance that you have in arena setting.
Interesting. So let's talk about those smaller settings. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it does. Does it go down to the individual, like a one-on-one kind of experience?
Yes.
So let's talk about that because this is where I think people perhaps struggle the most of all the elements of social anxiety because you have to interact one to one at some point. And if you are going to interview for a job, if you're going to be doing functional things in a workplace, in a public setting, and that is often the one that has the most body language involved, right? And facial expressions involved, the little unspoken parts of our interactions. How have you tried to solve for how we experience that in a VR setting, or do you feel like the virtual reality and the avatars in there actually do a decent job of giving the same kind of body language and facial expressions that you would have in a one-on-one conversation like we're having today?
We have features for body language in specifically. So we can give feedback on the learners, the user's body language, because obviously communication isn't just about what you say, and actually that's a very small part of the content of what you actually say. It's more about the tone, your body language, and so on. So we give feedback on each of those elements. But in terms of the avatars around you, we have two types of avatars. So one type is photorealistic, and they're pre-filmed, they're on the loop of maybe 30 seconds or a minute, and they'll be doing things like, I don't know, lifting up coffee and chatting to each other, or but they're not interactive, so they won't react to what you say, or they won't put their hand up and ask a question. But the benefit is that they look like real people because they've been filmed. And then we have a second type of avatar, which is a computer generated avatar. Now, obviously, these don't look as realistic because they're not real, but they are reactive and interactive. So you could be talking about anything in a presentation or having a difficult conversation with someone, and they can adjust their body language, or they can put their hand up and ask you a question during a presentation. And something we're actually developing at the moment, which is very difficult to do, is to react with emotions as well, because emotions are very difficult to recreate, like small frowns, or someone's angry and their nostrils might flare, that kind of thing. So that's something that we're developing at the moment and hopefully releasing soon. So at the moment, ours don't do that, but they will do that shortly. And lots of these things that I'm talking about in terms of the reactivity have been made possible with the developments of AI, being able to understand what people are saying and then react in a more human like way because of that.